Man, it's weird to think about that night. It was probably '03 or '04. I was barely 19 and fresh out of high school, working the graveyard shift at a gas station just off the old Interstate 77. The place was a relic, one of those rundown stops you only see in bad horror movies, with maybe a couple of truckers or some lost family stopping by every few hours. My world back then was small. It was just me, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the smell of stale coffee, and the constant hum of the old refrigeration units. I was trying to save up for a beat-up car so I could finally get out of that town, and that job was the only thing I could find. Nights were usually a blur of cleaning sticky counters, restocking candy bars that nobody ever bought, and listening to classic rock on a tinny radio. It was boring, but it was a peaceful kind of boring. I'd sit there and do my homework, or just zone out, lost in my own thoughts, with the quiet drone of the place as my only company. It was a routine so predictable I could practically do it in my sleep. Everything changed around 2 a.m. I was just finishing a math problem, my pencil scratching against the paper, when I glanced up at the security monitor. The screen was a grainy mess of black and white, but it was clear enough to see a figure standing by the third pump. This wasn't a car pulling up. This was a guy, just standing there, hands at his sides, staring directly at the store. He wasn't doing anything, just standing. I figured his car was probably hidden from the camera, or maybe he was on the phone, but there was something off about his posture. He was stiff, completely motionless, like a statue carved out of shadow. I watched him for a minute, then 2, then 5, and he never even shifted his weight. My stomach got a little knot in it. I tried to go back to my homework, but my eyes kept getting drawn back to that fuzzy monitor, to the man who was just a cold, silent presence in the lonely night. The feeling of being watched started to creep in, thick and heavy, like a FOG to an hour later. He was still there. The hands of the clock crawled by, but he didn't move. My initial curiosity had turned into genuine worry, and then into a low-grade dread. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was a hitchhiker who got dropped off, but why not come inside to get warm? It was a chilly night for late spring, and he wasn't dressed for it. On the grainy feed, I could just make out that his head was tilted at a strange, unnatural angle, almost as if he was straining his neck. He was wearing this heavy, dark coat that looked far too thick for the weather, and it made him look like a solid block of darkness against the dim light of the pumps. I kept waiting for a flicker of movement, a twitch, anything that would prove he was a real person and not some kind of terrifying mannequin placed there to freak me out. Nothing. Not a single muscle moved that I finally decided I had to do something. My brain was screaming at me to just lock the doors and call the police, but my stubbornness and the faint sense of duty I had told me I couldn't just ignore a person who might be in distress. With my heart doing a stutter step, I grabbed the heavy flashlight from under the counter, its cold metal feeling like a lead weight in my hand. I walked towards the glass front door, every step a little heavier than the last. The familiar, comforting buzz of the refrigerators seemed to die out, replaced by a deafening silence. It was like the inside of the store was holding its breath, waiting for me to step into the unknown. I fumbled with the key, my fingers trembling, and with a soft click, I unlocked the door that suddenly felt like the only barrier between me and the night. The moment the door swung open, the cold night air hit me with a jolt. I was out on the concrete, the powerful security light humming directly over my head. The man was right there, maybe 30 feet away, standing perfectly still. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His face was an unnatural shade of pale, almost gray, and his wide eyes weren't focused on me, but on something just over my shoulder, through the reflection in the store window. His coat wasn't just dark, it was a rough, black wool that seemed to absorb the light around him, making him look like a hole in the fabric of reality. It was impossibly still and quiet out there. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind around the pumps and the frantic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. I felt like I was interrupting a private, terrifying moment. I took a shaky step forward, raising my flashlight, and my voice cracked as I tried to speak. "Hey, are you okay out there? Do you need some help?" The words sounded ridiculously small and weak in the open space. He didn't even twitch. Not a single sign that he heard me. I swung the flashlight beam around, trying to see if there was a car I'd missed, but there was nothing. The lot was completely empty except for him. He was like a human alarm bell, a silent, unmoving figure trying to tell me something with his sheer presence. The complete lack of response sent a fresh wave of ice water through my veins. This wasn't a person with a broken-down car. This was something else. My hand instinctively reached for the doorknob again, and I took a step back. That's when I saw it. Just a hint of movement, a flicker of shadow at the base of the pump closest to the man. It was low to the ground, a hunched shape that was so completely still and quiet that my eyes had a hard time registering it. It was like my brain was trying to convince me it was just a shadow, a misplaced tarp, anything but what it was. I could see a series of unnatural, jerky motions as it slowly pulled itself further back into the deeper shadows behind the pump, as if trying to hide from my gaze. My mind, now in full panic mode, realized with a cold clarity that the man wasn't just standing there. He was watching something. He was watching for something. I let out a small, involuntary gasp, and the hunched figure stopped moving. It paused, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I could see it rotate its head in my direction. The shadows were too deep to make out any real features, but I felt it. I felt the weight of its attention on me, cold and heavy. I dropped the flashlight with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the still night. The beam spun wildly on the ground, casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the asphalt. In that frantic moment, my eyes darted back to the man by the pump, and I understood. His wide, terrified stare wasn't directed at the store. It was directed through the store's window, at my own reflection. He wasn't watching the store. He was a sentry, watching for what was hiding behind it. The hunched figure began to move again, this time with a deliberate, slow, and scraping sound, like dried leaves being dragged across the concrete. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled back into the store, slamming the door shut with a frantic desperation. My hands shook so violently that I fumbled with the key for what felt like an eternity before I finally managed to lock it. Pressing my face against the cold glass, I peered out, my breath fogging the window. The hunched figure was gone, but standing in the exact spot where the man had been, now impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to bend the wrong way, was the creature. Its long, pale shape was a sickening sight under the streetlights, and it was staring directly at me with a face that was a pale, featureless blur. The man was gone. He had vanished into thin air, leaving me alone with the thing he had been watching. It stood there for a few seconds, its head tilted just like his had been, and then a low, guttural chittering sound started to emanate from it, rattling the glass. My heart was in my throat, a frantic, pounding thing trying to claw its way out. I needed to get away from the windows, to hide, to call for help. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and scrambled behind the counter, my mind frantically cycling through all the things I was supposed to do in an emergency. The silent alarm button. That was it. My only hope. As I dove behind the counter, I heard a new sound. It wasn't the chittering anymore, which had abruptly stopped. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, not on the door, but on the large front window, coming from multiple directions at once. Tap, tap, tap. I could hear it all around me, like dozens of long, bony fingers were tracing the glass surrounding the store. I saw brief, distorted outlines of impossibly long limbs pressing against the glass, making the tapping sound. It was the creature, somehow everywhere at once, testing the barrier between us. My entire body was frozen, and I just huddled there, holding my breath. As the tapping grew louder and more insistent, I slammed my palm down on the silent alarm button with all the force I could muster. The moment I did, the tapping stopped instantly. The silence that followed was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise. I stayed huddled there, curled up in a ball, my body trembling uncontrollably, until the flashing lights of the police cars finally pulled into the gas station lot. They found me a wreck, pointing frantically at the empty pumps and the perfectly intact windows. The security footage from the night was nothing but static, and the officers just looked at me with pitying, confused eyes. They told me I probably fell asleep and had a bad dream. I never went back to that gas station. To this day, I don't know what that thing was, or why that man was there. But I'll never forget the image of him, standing motionless in the dark, a cold, silent warning that I was seconds away from walking into a trap. I can still see his wide, terrified eyes in my mind. The eyes of a man who wouldn't leave because he was protecting me from something I couldn't see. So I've been a night owl my whole life, not by choice, but because of my old job. Back in 2018, I was fresh out of college, broke, and working the graveyard shift at a gas station just outside of town. It was a pretty typical stretch of highway, not much around except for endless cornfields and a diner that closed at 10 p.m. My life was pretty monotonous then. I'd show up at 11 p.m., watch the clock tick by, maybe talk to a few truckers or a couple of kids on a late-night drive, and then head home as the sun came up, with a brain that felt like static. It was just a way to pay the bills, a temporary blur in my life that I was itching to move past. The nights were usually quiet, almost too quiet. You get used to the hum of the fridge, the low glow of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional car passing by. The most exciting thing that would happen was a deer wandering into the parking lot. But one night, everything changed. I was wiping down the counter around 1 a.m., lost in my own thoughts, when the front door burst open. The bell above the door, the one that usually gave a soft little ding, sounded more like a panicked clatter. A man stumbled in, and I knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. He wasn't like the usual customers. He was wearing a simple jacket and jeans, but his face was a pale shade of gray, and his eyes were wide, darting around the store like he was expecting something to jump out from behind the chip racks. He was completely out of breath, like he had been running for a long time, that he came straight up to the counter, his hands trembling so violently that the coins he pulled out of his pocket rattled against the formica. He asked, in a voice that was barely a whisper, if he could use the phone. It was an old landline, the kind we kept behind the counter for emergencies, with a long, coiled cord. As he dialed, his fingers fumbled over the numbers, and he kept glancing over his shoulder at the empty parking lot. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his side of the conversation was all hushed, frantic fragments. Just, please no, not here. I don't know. I think so. He sounded terrified, like he was trying to convince someone, or maybe himself, that everything was going to be okay. He hung up abruptly, his eyes still fixated on the door. He didn't even acknowledge me at first, just stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. Finally, he looked at me, and his eyes, a strange shade of amber, were filled with a desperate intensity I'll never forget. He didn't ask for help or tell me what was wrong. He just said, in a voice so low I had to strain to hear it, "If anyone comes asking for me, tell them you haven't seen me." It was a strange request, and the way he said it made my stomach drop. It wasn't a casual thing, it was a command, a plea. He didn't wait for me to respond. He just turned, and with one last, terrified look at the door, he slipped out into the darkness, disappearing into the night as if he were never there. I just stood there. The image of his panic-stricken face burned into my mind. The silence in the store suddenly feeling heavy and wrong, that my heart was pounding in my chest. I kept replaying his words, his face, the way his hands shook. I tried to convince myself that it was probably some domestic dispute, or maybe a prank, but the sheer terror in his eyes felt too real, too raw. I went back to wiping the counter, but my movements were stiff and mechanical. I kept finding myself glancing at the door, half expecting him to come back, or for something else to happen. The silence that had been so familiar just minutes before was now a source of dread. Every little creak, every flicker of the lights, made me jump. I remember the scent of cleaning solution and stale coffee filling the air, a weird, mundane contrast to the unsettling feeling that had taken root in my gut. Then, the sound came. A screeching of tires, loud and aggressive, ripped through the quiet of the night. A dark SUV, so black it seemed to swallow the light, skidded into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness like two angry eyes. It wasn't just a car pulling in. It was a vehicle on a mission, and the way it stopped, with a final, violent jerk, told me everything I needed to know. The engine was still roaring when the doors flew open, and two men stepped out. They were both tall, dressed in dark, nondescript clothes, but there was something about their posture, their movements, that felt predatory. They didn't even look at the gas pumps. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, immediately started scanning the front of the building. The men moved with a chilling efficiency. One of them had a jawline so sharp it looked like it could cut glass, and his eyes were a startlingly pale blue, completely devoid of any warmth. The other was broader, with a scar that ran from his hairline down to his eyebrow, making his face look permanently contorted. They didn't talk, didn't make a sound. They just moved, their heads swiveling, their gazes sweeping over the front of the building, the shadows, the corners. It was like they were hunting something, and I was just a part of the landscape they were scrutinizing. Their presence filled the air with a cold, suffocating dread. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back, trying to shrink behind the counter, to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Then their eyes landed on the store's window and on me. The man with the scar raised his hand, pointing a single, steady finger in my direction. There was no hesitation, no question in his movement. They had spotted me. The two of them started walking towards the store, their strides long and deliberate. Every step they took felt like a hammer blow to my chest. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they weren't here for gas or a snack. They were here for the man who had just left, and they knew I had seen him. They didn't need to ask. The look in their eyes was a silent question and a threat all in one. I could feel my heart racing, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, and the fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, too revealing. The bell above the door didn't just ding this time. It practically screamed as they pushed the door open. The silence they had maintained outside was now inside, but it felt even heavier. The man with the pale eyes came right up to the counter, his gaze never leaving mine. His partner stood a few feet behind him, his presence a solid, intimidating block of shadow. The air was thick with tension, and the scent of gasoline and plastic seemed to be replaced by something acrid and metallic. The man didn't say a word at first, just stared, a silent interrogation that went on for an eternity. He wasn't asking for anything. He was assessing me, sizing me up, deciding what to do. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, like sandpaper. "Did you see anyone come in here?" he asked, but it wasn't a question. It was a statement, a challenge. A man, about 6 feet tall, dark hair. I felt a knot of pure panic tighten in my stomach. My mouth was dry, and I could feel a cold sweat trickling down my back. His partner's eyes were still scanning the store, a silent sentry, and the silence between us stretched on, growing more and more unbearable. I knew what the man who left had told me to say, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. I couldn't lie, but I couldn't tell them the truth. Either I just shook my head slowly, trying to look as innocent and bewildered as I could, my voice a shaky whisper. "No, no one." The words felt hollow as they left my lips. The man's pale eyes narrowed, and a small, almost imperceptible smirk played on his lips. He leaned closer, and I could smell a faint scent of stale cigarettes and something else, something metallic and unsettling. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice still low, but with an edge of steel now. "We saw a car over there, and we followed it. We know he came in here." He gestured vaguely towards the road, but his eyes were fixed on me, trying to break me. I felt like I was drowning, trapped between the man who had just left and the two terrifying figures in front of me. I just repeated myself, my voice trembling now. I'm sure. I've been here all night. No one like that came in." The lie was out, and I just had to stick with it. The man with the scar took a step forward, and I flinched, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. But then, the man at the counter just straightened up, his smirk widening slightly. He gave a sharp nod to his partner. "All right then," he said, his voice surprisingly calm now. "My mistake." He turned, and they both walked out, just as silent and efficient as they had been when they came in. The door closed, and the silence returned, but this time, it was laced with a chilling finality. I sank against the counter, my legs feeling like jelly, and watched as their dark SUV sped away, disappearing into the night, leaving me alone with the quiet, and with a fear that still, to this day, makes me double-check the locks on my door at night. You know, it's funny how you can get used to a routine. I was 22, living in the middle of nowhere, just trying to save up enough money to get out of that town. My life back then was pretty simple. Work the night shift at the old gas station on the edge of town, go home, sleep, and repeat. The place was a relic, a single pump and a tiny convenience store that hadn't been updated since the 80s. Most nights, it was dead quiet. Just me, the hum of the fridge, and the endless stretch of dark highway. I'd spend my time either stocking shelves or just staring out at the empty road, my mind drifting to anything but the present. The silence was my normal, my routine, and for the most part, it was a comfort. It felt safe, predictable. But that all changed 7 nights ago. It started like any other night. The clock on the wall was just ticking over to 2 a.m. when I saw the headlights. It was an old sedan, the kind that looks like it's been through a war, with faded paint that was once probably a shade of blue, but was now just sad. The car rolled to a stop at the pump, and the driver, a man in his late 50s with a face that seemed completely devoid of emotion, got out. He was tall and lanky, and his movements were slow and deliberate. He came to the window, and his eyes, a kind of watery gray, were fixed on me. They weren't angry or friendly, they were just there. He just stood there, staring, until I opened the window. All he said was, $2 of gas. No, please, no thank you. Just a flat statement. I filled the tank. He paid with 2 crumpled $1 bills, and he drove off without a word. It was weird, but I didn't think much of it. Not at first, and that was the start of the routine. For the next 6 nights, the same thing happened. Exactly at 2 a.m., that faded blue sedan would pull up, the tall man with the empty eyes would get out, and he'd ask for $2 of gas. The way he said it never changed, like he was playing a recording. And he never, ever stopped staring at me. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a deep, unwavering gaze that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He'd just stand there, a silent statue, while I filled the tank and he paid with the same 2 crumpled bills. I started to notice little things about him. His clothes were always the same. A faded denim jacket that was too big for his lanky frame, and a pair of worn-out work pants. He never wore a hat, and his hair was thin and slicked back with what looked like old grease. By the 3rd night, I was actively dreading 2 a.m. My mind would race, trying to come up with a reason for this ritual, but nothing made sense. It felt deliberate, like a test I didn't know I was taking. On the 7th night, my gut was in knots even before he showed up. I remember looking at the clock, watching the second hand sweep closer to 2 a.m., my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to convince myself it was just a strange coincidence, that he was just a man with a very specific routine, but every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. When the clock finally hit 2, my fears were confirmed. The car didn't roll in quietly like it usually did. It screeched to a halt, the sound of the tires a harsh, metallic rip in the silence of the night. The headlights, which were always dim, seemed to flicker with an unnatural intensity, casting long, dancing shadows across the empty lot. And the man, he wasn't his usual still, almost relaxed self. He was leaning forward in the driver's seat, his back rigid, and his eyes were even more locked on me than before. There was a desperate, almost hungry look in them now, a new energy that was utterly terrifying. That was the moment the dread really set in. I remember feeling this wave of cold wash over me, a physical reaction to the change in his demeanor. I moved slowly, almost robotically, towards the pump, my eyes never leaving his face. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat there, stiff as a board, his eyes boring into me through the grimy windshield. As I got closer, I saw it. The back seat wasn't empty like it had been every other night. It was filled with stuff, a chaotic jumble of things that didn't belong in a car. There were 2 suitcases piled on top of each other, one of them a beat-up Samsonite with a broken handle, the other a plain black duffel bag. And sitting on top of them, coiled like a snake, was a thick length of new-looking nylon rope. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat in the sudden, deafening silence. Then I saw something else. Tucked beneath a faded blanket, a corner of something metallic glinted under the harsh light of the pump. My breath hitched in my throat. It was the chrome handle of a shovel. Not a garden shovel, but one of those heavy-duty, long-handled ones you'd use for digging trenches. The sight of it, combined with the rope in the suitcases, sent a jolt of pure terror through me. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. This wasn't a man with a strange routine. This was a man on a mission. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to go back inside and lock the door, to grab the phone and call someone. But I was frozen. He was still staring at me, a silent, unblinking sentinel, and the look in his eyes wasn't just hungry anymore. It was expectant, as if he was waiting for me to make a move, to do something he was anticipating. I felt like a character in a play, and he was just waiting for me to deliver my line. He finally moved, but it wasn't to get out of the car. He just slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $2 bills, holding them up against the window glass. The gesture was so familiar, so routine, that for a split second, a flicker of normalcy returned. But it was just that, a flicker. My hands were shaking as I took the money, the crinkled paper feeling strangely hot between my fingers. I remember looking down at the bills, at the familiar face of George Washington, and thinking, this is it. This is the last normal thing I'll do tonight. As I finished pumping the gas, I made a conscious effort to keep my eyes on the nozzle, on the little numbers ticking up on the screen, anywhere but on him. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck like a physical weight, a burning presence that made my skin crawl. The air was thick with it, with a silent, suffocating tension that felt like it was squeezing the breath out of me. He drove away just as silently as he had for the past 6 nights. But this time, the absence of the car wasn't a relief. It was a countdown. I ran back inside, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, and locked the door, fumbling with the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I remember leaning against the door, eyes squeezed shut, trying to catch my breath. The silence of the store, which had been my comfort, now felt like a vast, empty void, filled with the echo of his stare. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he wasn't gone for good. This wasn't the end of the ritual. It was the beginning of something else entirely. The rope, the shovel, the suitcases, they were for a purpose, and I had a horrible feeling that I was the reason for all of it. I felt trapped, completely alone and completely exposed. The rest of the night was a blur of me just standing there, staring at the front door, waiting. After that night, I didn't see him again. The gas station was back to its quiet, eerie silence, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Now, it was a heavy, watchful silence, and I spent every night staring at the clock, waiting for 2 a.m. to hit, my heart pounding in my ears. The car never came back. The man never showed up again, but that didn't bring me any peace. In fact, it made things worse. The absence of the routine was more terrifying than the routine itself. The fear wasn't about what he was going to do to me anymore, but about why he didn't do it. Was he waiting? Was he just gone? I didn't know, and the not knowing was the worst part of all. It felt like I had a target on my back, and he was out there, somewhere, just biding his time. I felt like a ticking time bomb, and I had no idea when I was going to go off. The next day, I called my manager, a kind old man named Frank. I told him I needed to quit, that I couldn't do the night shift anymore, but I didn't tell him why. I just couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud. He was understanding, of course, and he told me to take a few days off and think about it. I did, but I didn't change my mind. I didn't even leave my apartment. I just sat there, my mind replaying every detail of that night over and over again. The suitcases, the rope, the shovel. I knew I had to get out of that town, but not just because I was saving up money anymore. Now, it was a matter of survival. I packed my bags, got in my car, and I drove off, leaving that old gas station and that empty town behind me for good. I never went back. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. I never saw his face again, but I see his empty eyes every time I close mine, and I can still feel the cold dread of that night. Even after all these years, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. I've spent so many nights wondering, was I just a part of a larger plan? Was he looking for something I had? Was I just a witness, someone who saw too much? The questions have haunted me for years, a ghost in my mind I can't shake. I've moved on, built a life for myself far away from that place. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I find myself staring at the clock, waiting. I know he won't be there, but the feeling of being watched, of being a pawn in a game I didn't know I was playing, has never truly left me. I guess some routines are just impossible to break.